Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And we're going to do a little bit of a catch-up episode today. We've been busy doing competition reviews and mostly competition reviews. But Alex, I know you had a big workshop in the Caymans.
Yeah.
I've done a couple dives here and there.
You've been diving quite regularly, though, at least, haven't you?
Trying, at least once or twice a week. So we're going to talk a little bit about your Cayman trip, a little bit about some gear stuff. So if you would like to dive, to no pun intended, dive into Cayman, start with that.
Well, I reported live from Cayman at the end. Went to Cayman to run a couple of underwater photography workshops. They were my 30th and 31st underwater photography workshops with that dive center called Ocean Frontiers in Cayman. So it was fairly familiar territory for me, as you might imagine, after 31 weeks of workshops there. It certainly felt like I knew what I was doing. The reason I keep going back is that for me, it's the best kind of teaching workshop I do. But just the nature of the diving in Grand Cayman, it's perfect place to teach wide angle. The dive conditions are super easy. You've got clear, warm water, no currents, the water's nice and still. It's like diving in a swimming pool a lot of the time. And there's an abundance of nice scenery to shoot. And I think scenery is a great place to learn wide angle shooting, shooting colorful sponges and sea fans on the walls, shooting, nice corals and fish on the shallow reefs, shooting caves and caverns, shooting shipwrecks. And so all of that, I think, leads, to a really good workshop, because each of those different aspects, you can focus on different things and they're going to be there. If you do you go somewhere and it's like, right, this dive, it's all about trying to shoot hammerheads this way, and then the hammerheads don't turn up. Yeah. So the great thing about Cayman is, the sponges are going to be there. You know what the light is going to be like, because I've taught the workshop so many times. So you can really send people in the water saying, look, the light's going to be doing this. So use it in this way. Think about it. It's going to be, and it just makes for a really good teaching experience. We have a pool on site as well where people can work on their technique, and that's invaluable as well. So although it's not the most exciting destination for me, not because it's not nice diving, it's just I've done it a lot. I do really enjoy going back there regularly. And I know I don't normally, when we have these catch-ups, I tend to talk more about what I've done on the trip rather than the workshop side. But I think the reason I go to Cayman is for that. Another advantage of going to Cayman is that Ryan Cannon, who's I guess he's the boss of Reef Photo Video, lives there. So it's rather an easy place to borrow underwater photography gear for me, because my old friend, I'll put an embarrassing old picture of me and Ryan in here if I remember. That's a really great one where we're both, it must be from 20 years ago. And yeah, it's a funny old picture, which I try and email it to him at least once every year or so, just to make us both smile. It's when my book, The Art of Diving, came out, which was 2006. So I guess it was 2006. So nearly 20 years ago. Neither of us have changed that much, actually, because I didn't have any hair then, and he's still got thick brown hair now. So yeah, we haven't changed too much. Anyway, I digress. It's a great place to borrow gear. I borrowed the Canon R5 Mark II for this trip, which I really enjoyed shooting. And we did the review at the end of my first week on the workshop, but I didn't park the camera up. And actually, one of the things, I liked that camera enough that I wanted to carry on shooting it. There are, as I said, I feel it's a very similar level product to the Z8 and, say, the A7 R5, Sony, which is kind of, those are its main rivals it's kind of pitched against. And I would say that there's areas it's ahead and areas it's slightly behind. But it sits at that level. And I wouldn't get overexcited by, the areas it's ahead, and I wouldn't get overly upset by the areas it's behind. I definitely, as a macro camera, I feel its autofocus is quite a bit better than the Sony's. Someone asked after the video, how do you talked about it in the review, comparing it to the Sony A7 R5. How does it compare to your Sony A1? And I hadn't really thought so deeply on that question, but went off during the second week and made an effort to shoot the two of them back to back. And definitely as a macro autofocusing camera, the Sony is a lot smarter than the Canon is a lot smarter. The A1 is fast and accurate, but isn't very smart. The Sony, so the Canon R5 Mark II is fast, generally pretty accurate, and very smart. So, and it's very, very good at picking eyes in subjects. So if you shoot predominantly little fish, shrimps, things with eyes, even, Shaun the Sheeps, as we talked about in the review, it's really impressive for that type of shooting as an autofocus. And so I really liked it. And I went back and shot, on alternate dives, the same subjects with the two cameras, shooting the Sony with the 90mm, the Canon with the 100. And the Canon, it was definitely a lot easier to get the shots. So noticeably so. So I definitely put it ahead. Now, my A1 is now a camera that's been superseded. So I suspect from what you've said to me about the A9 Mark III, which the A1 Mark II has a lot of features in common with, I feel that probably the comparison there is those probably sit very close to the R5 Mark II and are probably, either slightly ahead or slightly behind. And I think that's probably what those cameras would give a Sony user, those same features that new Canon now has, would be my guess.
The disadvantage of the two Sony cameras is that they're substantially more expensive than the R5 is. So, is that little bit of autofocus boost worth, $1,000 or $2,000? Maybe not. The A9 III, and sorry, we're going on a little bit of a tangent here, is by far the best, and I haven't used the R5 Mark II, but the A9 III is, once I got it situated, it's not as, I always describe the Nikon autofocus systems as being dumb, but what they do fantastically. Like the Z8, you put it in 3D tracking and leave it there, and that's all you have to do. The A9 III takes more tweaking, but once you have it tweaked, it's ridiculous. So I imagine the A1 II is going to be, 99% of that. And I don't know how the R5 II stacks up, but the A9 III is very impressive. So, all of these cameras these days are plenty capable of getting you the pictures that you need, especially if you spend some time learning the autofocus systems and then tweaking them to how you shoot or what you shoot.
Yeah, I found with the R5 Mark II, I said it in our review video, that I didn't like the autofocus for macro when I first did it. And I really struggled on my first dive to get much, in focus the way I did. But I didn't dive into its settings. Yeah. I simply gave myself those few dives to get used to it. And kind of once I realized the way it was thinking, I was able to really exploit it better. Was the way I approached it anyway. Yeah. And that avoided me having to read any manuals. So.
I'm not a manual reader either. But eventually I sorted out how to get the A9 III to work how I wanted it to. Mm-hmm. And then it's nearly flawless. And it's the only camera I've shot so far. And this isn't underwater, but Naya has black spots around her eyes and she has dark eyes. It's the only camera that can figure out her eyes, even if they're totally shaded. That I've shot so far, which is cool because usually that can throw them off and I'm focusing on the spots around her eyes or something like that. And it is also the only camera I've shot, mirrorless camera I've shot that properly focuses with a red light underwater. Okay. So that's one of the big, frustrations for mirrorless shooters is using a red focus light. Those cameras just get completely bamboozled and don't know, and they can't focus properly. As far as I can tell, the A9 III focuses just as well with red light as it does using no white or anything like that, which is nice for, anytime you need that red focus light, especially at night.
Yeah. And I know you've also been trying the Marelux strobes as well since.
So I try to have
which we also covered on the show when I tried them.
Yeah.
So how do you find them? Yeah.
So the first time I tried to take them out, which was a while ago, I was having some issues with them firing reliably. I think it ended up being a battery issue. I got that sorted out. So I took them out recently. And they're not my favorites. I think they do a few things really well. One of the big marketing specs behind them is the MTL mode, which allows you to shoot, a billion frames a second and the strobe will keep up and it won't lose exposure. I will say that works really well.
But how high can you turn it up when doing that mode?
So the most you can get is half power. So even if you have the dial, so even if you have the dial set all the way to 12, you're getting the equivalent of half power. I wasn't shooting it that high. I was shooting Pike Flennies with it here locally and trying to get them to do the display. In MTL mode, it worked. The strobes worked flawlessly. I'm not a fan of the ergonomics. The dials are fiddly, and maybe it's just the two that I have. they're a bit loose, so they don't hard stop really where they're supposed to. But in terms of them firing, they fired fine in MTL mode. I didn't have any goofy exposures. I didn't have any issues where they didn't fire, anything like that. Outside of MTL mode, in normal manual mode, was an exercise in frustration. And again, I don't know if it's just the two that I have, but randomly they would blow out and my whole frame would be white, even after the previous image was exposed properly, or they wouldn't fire at all, or they would fire. They wouldn't sync properly, so they're firing after the picture's been taken, things like that. Sorry, you're waiting to ask something.
No, yeah, I was trying to diagnose. I mean, usually, often that whiting out can actually be a lens issue of a lens not stopping down properly for shooting. But the mirrorless lenses, they often hold them quite stop down anyway, and actually you can shoot open aperture, so it has to open up to shoot. Yeah. So it probably isn't that issue. I was just trying to think through, because I know that you have been using that adapted Canon, and sometimes the lenses on the adapters, those are the sort of bugs you get on adapted lenses of apertures not working properly on every frame.
Yeah. So this was shooting just the Tamron 90 on the.
Oh well, that's not an adapted lens. So yeah,
not adapted.
Are you still loving that, by the way?
Yeah, it's still. So there's. Well, I'll mention that briefly. Okay. At least on my setup, I think that the Tamron is just a tiny bit shorter than the Sony 90. So it sits a bit further back in the port, and it sits just far enough back that I think it's going to need its own dedicated port, at least if you plan to use diopters or the EMWL or things like that. Diopters, it seems okay, and I think with the MFO or the SMC3, it's probably better. With the SMC1, it sits far enough back that your focus distance is like that far, so you have to be right on top of whatever you're shooting, and there's a little bit of weird things in the corners. And then with the EMWL, it sits far enough back that you do get vignetting and you get some swirliness in your corners. My solution to that the other day, because that was my first time shooting it on my setup with the EMWL, was just to put the A1 in crop mode, because you still get 25 megapixels or whatever it is, and then it cut out all of that vignetting in the corner issues. But I think going forward using the EMWL, I'll stick with the Sony 90, and then maybe eventually get a port for the Tamron if I ever ended up keeping that.
Well, I would say rather than that is maybe just get a shorter flat port.
Yeah.
Like the one for the that you use with the 28 to 60 with the WWL.
Yeah, and just get an extension.
And then get an extension, or even get a custom extension made to put it in exactly the right place.
Yeah, so that's another option as well. I really like the lens. I think the center of the frame with the EMWL and the Tamron is sharper than the Sony is with the EMWL. But again, obviously you're a bit limited by the corner performance. So if I plan on shooting the EMWL, at least for now, I'll stick with the Sony. The other thing I've been shooting lately is...
I did kind of cut you off a bit on the Marelux strobe.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, just because you are, I know that, Marelux are very careful at controlling their press, and they obviously have their team of ambassadors who are out there telling everyone that everything is amazing. And so I think people do value kind of us putting something independent out there on it. So it is, I mean, I'm not trying to draw attention to the issues. I'm going to probably take them again I want to try their smaller strobes. So I'm probably going to take both sets, both the big ones and the small ones, to the Philippines to try when I go next week. I think because also lithium strobes are well suited to Blackwater diving because of that fast recycle time. Even if you're not on a digger mode, you still, I still think it's a valuable feature to have. And actually, I'm going to completely sidetrack the conversation here, is that actually one of the things I wanted to mention was that I was using the HF-1. I did 2 Blackwater dives in Cayman. We did them as part of the first workshop. The Cayman is great for Blackwater diving because on the west side of the island, the operator there called Don Foster's have been developing Blackwater diving there. And the visibility is great. It's like the Gulfstream diving. I don't think it's as rich as the Gulfstream or as Cozumel in both those places, I think they get more of the cool, weird stuff.
Yeah.
But Cayman is a brilliant place to go for just really busy Blackwater dives in great visibility. But anyway, the reason I mentioned this was that actually on one of the Blackwater dives, my flash trigger, just batteries ran out. They were fine before the dive. I took a lot of pictures on the dive because there was a lot of things to shoot. And with about 10 minutes of the dive to go, my flash trigger ran out, and I got a last few shots out, and then it was done. But actually, because I had the HF-1s on, I turned the strobes on to video mode. And having watched our review and learnt that actually you can get the maximum power out of them by pressing the V, turning them to the V mode and turning them on, you get the maximum power. I put them on the maximum power, and it was bright enough to take usable Blackwater shots of some subjects. So although my flash trigger would let me down, I bumped my ISO up a bit. I'm just going to bring the picture up here on the other computer. Yeah, I put the ISO up to 1000, opened the aperture to f10, which I would normally try and shoot a bit more closed down for Blackwater. But at 1000, 80th of a second, f10, I could get usable Blackwater shots with the HF-1s.
Nice.
So it was a good rescue mission.
Yeah.
And I'll also put a video up while we're talking about me shooting. I just shot some GoPro footage with them on as well on one of the dives. And you can see that outside the caves, they do nothing. But inside the darkness of the caves on the dive sites at the east end of Grand Cayman, which is one of our, we love diving there because of these caves and caverns that cut through the reef. The lights do a really good job. So, I think that they are a useful video light, particularly if you dive with a GoPro, and particularly if you dive into darker environments like inside wrecks and inside caves and things. That they do have a good role to play. But thinking that light is powerful enough diving in the tropics in bright conditions, it's not.
Yeah.
So yeah, they have a role to play, and they save my butt for 10 minutes on a Blackwater. So praise to that feature.
One other thing that I would like to test with the HF-1s and the Kraken 160s, actually, since I have them both here, is I want to see how they do shooting continuous at half power like the Marelux does in MTL mode, to see if the Marelux actually has any significant advantage doing that.
Probably you should also do it maybe normalize, or setting to the same light output.
Yeah.
So set the exposure so it's correct at the Marelux one, and set the others to see what they can they stand up to.
Yeah, so I'm going to try both of those. So hopefully by the next time you guys see a catch-up episode, I'll have taken care of that, and we can report back. The other cool thing that I've been shooting is our friend of the show, good buddy Isaac, who everybody watching this probably knows at this point. Spent some time building me a custom curved port for the Canon 50mm macro, and we're going to do
off to my heart there. I'm a big fan of curved port macro.
We are going to do a whole episode on curved ports in the future. Because there's some really cool benefits to them. And even though the Canon on my Sony is glacially slow, I have figured out ways to work around that, and the image quality is spectacular. So I'm going to, and especially for a lot of things I shoot, which are generally larger subjects, it's going to be a go-to lens for me. So shout out to Isaac for helping me out with that. And like I said, we'll go into a whole curved port episode at some point and show pictures and talk about the benefits and potential drawbacks as well. Yeah,
it's something that I've loved for a long time. What else did I get up to in Cayman of technical interest? One thing I tried on one of the dives is on that changeover day in between my two workshops in Cayman, I went out to the Botanic Gardens with Andrew McLaughlin, and we recorded a quick video on the new strobes he was trying for that, and that episode is out there. But we actually spent a bit of time photographing topside, just some of the birds and things. And because he's a very good topside photographer, he was kind of straight in the groove, and I'm a bit of a rubbish topside photographer. So I was sort of a bit slower into the groove than he was. But one of the things that he would do particularly with the water birds, feeding in the water, is he'd hold his camera down and shoot on the LCD with the LCD angled. And we can't do that with our LCDs underwater, because you can with your external viewfinder, but you can't just put the camera on the bottom and then angle the viewfinder up and hover above it, because it's inside the housing. But it did get me thinking about, actually, I think it made the point to me that you take very different photos with using a viewfinder compared to using an EVF. just the way you move the camera around, the way you compose pictures. So at the start of the next workshop week, I decided to go and do a dive, take my expensive Nauticam viewfinder off my housing, put a flat viewfinder on it, and do the whole dive shooting with the viewfinder. Now, the viewfinder compared to the EVF is rubbish for reviewing pictures.
You mean the LCD or the actual viewfinder?
The LCD, okay. Sorry. So I spent the whole dive shooting with the LCD and not using the EVF. I took my optical viewfinder off and just said, right, for this dive, I'm just going to do everything on the LCD. And by making it a change for the whole dive, it really changed the way I was composing. I'd shoot much more with the camera out at arm's length. And I used to shoot the SLR quite a lot like that. Shoot it blind like that. But obviously with the mirrorless camera, you're shooting it blind or not blind at all because you can see what's going on. I think reviewing the pictures is a lot harder like that. You don't get that same review. But I think it definitely did get me more of those kind of up and under camera angles that often create those really interesting shots. And so I would say going forward that I could see myself, say I was doing like a Raja Rampat wide angle trip. I could see myself, it's like a 30 dive trip or whatever it is. I could see myself doing maybe one dive every 10 where I purposely take my optical viewfinder off my housing, put a flat viewfinder on and do that dive just shooting with the LCD screen so that I spend the whole dive really working those more extreme angles. And trying that, and particularly with a small lens like the Nikonos 13, I really enjoyed that, and I felt it added something to my portfolio that if I carried on just with one way of viewfindering, I wouldn't have got.
Yeah.
So although I prefer the optical viewfinder, I think actually making that big change changed my photography and pushed me to create pictures I wouldn't have created otherwise. So broaden my portfolio.
I think I'm gonna have to give that a shot. I mean, I don't use a viewfinder, but I use the monitor, and I will still till forever. I will sing the praises of monitors in terms of shooting, and I'll go back to the Pike Blennies. I sat there with it for 45 minutes waiting for it to do its full display, and I got some half-hearted displays, but never did the full one. But I could do that because I could just look at the monitor and have it sit there.
Yeah, definitely more comfortable.
Crank down onto the LCD or looking through the viewfinder. And I like those really low perspective, which essentially is doing what the LCD screen does on land, where you can flip it up and be in whatever position, which I think is really helpful. But then, like you said, I think having one off might challenge you to do some different things that you wouldn't have necessarily thought about if you have a viewfinder on or a monitor on. So I think, like you said, I wouldn't do it all the time because I love my monitor, but I think I'll probably at some point just try to go back to shooting the LCD. Even though it's going to be weird because the monitor is always on my housing now.
No, and we had on this workshop again, we had people with monitors on, so it's good to see them out there and increasing in number. Never used to have them, so
it's funny because I was one of the people too where before I had one I was like, I don't need a monitor, and then I got one and now I use it all the time. And then if I lend it to somebody and they use it, they're like, oh, this is kind of nice. So I think monitors especially are one of the things that you really have to use before you can necessarily appreciate the benefits of them. As long as they're okay with a little bit extra bulk, I think they can be really valuable. But that's a whole discussion.
How do you manage sometimes in the shallows at Blue Heron? Is yours bright enough?
Yeah, so at least I don't have experience with things like the Anglerfish monitor or the Nauticam housed monitors. Yeah. Kraken monitor, I keep it at 50% brightness the whole time, and I've never had an issue seeing it. And then it's easy to bump that up if you need to. But the hardest thing that I found, and this is again because of my color issues, is trying to get the monitor and the LCD to be what's the word I'm looking for? Calibrated so that they're actually showing the same thing, because the monitor is a bit more contrasty than the LCD screen. So I have to sort that out, but and the colors are a bit off, but that's a me issue more than anything else, because I can't really see it. But yeah, even for when I was doing the springs and stuff, I was doing the springs for a whole week. I had the monitor on there the whole time. And it is really helpful, because then you don't have to get into as many weird positions, because you can just hold the camera in the weird position and then angle the monitor however you like and be able to see it. So maybe we do a whole other episode of monitors. We already have one out there if anybody hasn't seen that yet. But maybe we'll do another one eventually. But I think that's all I've got.
I think the other thing I was going to mention in Cayman is that ever since I wrote my book, the assignments book, I can't kick that idea out of my head. And on all my trips, I kind of started setting myself fun mini assignments, like for a day or two, just to like break it up, really. Like, you know, and like on this trip, I've never been a particularly big fan of, or particularly the categorization of high key, low key images. But people really like it, and it does drive people to take different types of pictures. So I thought I would challenge myself to do something that I don't like. And I've always liked, it's just a gimmicky thing. Yeah, some pictures look better this way, some pictures look better that way. Why make a name for it? Why make a thing for it? But actually, that's exactly the sort of challenge you should do as a photographer, is the stuff that pushes you out of your comfort zone. Yeah. And, you know, people don't push me out of my comfort zone because I'm usually the one running the trip. So I thought I would push myself out of my comfort zone by challenging myself to make a low key and a high key shot that I really like. So yeah, I had a go at that on the trip, and I quite like the high key. Like I do a lot of fish photography. I've always liked doing fish photography, but doing fish photography with overexposed backgrounds, I think really appeals to me. So you've got a natural white background behind subjects, not I put a white slate behind the subject. Doesn't it look great now? No, it doesn't. But actually trying to do it with what's naturally in the environment appeals to me a lot more. So I quite enjoyed that, and I've done it before on the sand, where particularly actually I remember when we did the workshops at Six Senses in Lamu in the Maldives. And there, the house has got amazing white sand. It's got patch reefs on a white sand slope, and there's loads of fish going backs and forwards between these patch reefs across the white sand. And it's a great place to shoot fish on these just this white background. Again, what's that background? It's just sand. And so I like that look a lot. And I think particularly in a portfolio where a lot of your macro is cool subject on a black background, it's quite nice to have cool subject on a white background. So I think I'm going to play with that idea more going forward. So I think that's what comes from giving yourselves these little challenges. It kind of bucks up your portfolio and makes you create different types of images. But yeah, that's kind of my Cayman catch up.
Well, cool. We'll have to have another one of these pretty soon, because you're going to have a trip in between now and the next time we record.
Yes, have a busy spring. So yeah.
So we'll squeeze in episodes here and there when we can. Hopefully have some good guests coming up as well. So as always, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your support. If you have any ideas for episodes or things you'd like to see, please leave them in the comments. We read all of them. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.